when I first heard the title of the book, Paris and Her Cathedrals, I thought, fantastic. Howard has become a 19e or a moderniste, and we're going to learn about the Paris's cathedrals, Notre-Dame, the American Cathedral by G.E. Street, the Armenian Cathedral, the two Russian cathedrals, one of them connected to a certain leader who will go unnamed, opened in 2016. But instead, Howard, you take us to the heart of the Middle Ages, to the huge cathedral building projects of the High Middle Ages, and to the Ile-de-France, the cathedrals that we learn and teach in art history surveys and that form the itinerary for so many tourists who come to Paris to discover the medieval. Now they're armed with an enormously useful tool for understanding what they're looking at in this Paris, which for me is one of the great 19th century cities of Europe, but for you is one of the great medieval centers of building, of learning, thinking, of religion, but of also other things. So I'm going to ask the obvious question to start our conversation, which is just to tell us a bit about the genesis of this book. Because you are not an art or architectural historian, but rather a scholar who, as far as I know, has studied primarily language and literature. And yet, in this book, you have written a fantastic visual and historic guide to some of the most beloved and visited religious buildings in the Ile-de-France and beyond. So could you tell us about that? Is this a continuation of your work as a scholar of French literature, a personal departure? Can you tell us what propelled you into this most traversed terrain, and in what ways your perspective from outside the discipline of art history has opened up for us new insights? It's a packed question.
It sure is. Is this working? Yeah. All right. Okay. I got to hold it really close. Okay. That's a good question. I never thought about that. I was once asked in a survey by a medieval journal why I became a medievalist, and I said simply, "Ça me plaît." It pleases me, and I think I took it on because when I looked at cathedrals, I didn't understand them, and I wanted to know more of them. I was impressed by them. I was moved by them. I was astonished by them, but I didn't really feel that I knew enough about them to add understanding to that emotional response. And part of what I wanted to do in the book is to show not only the origins of the cathedrals, which a lot of art historians, many of them at Columbia, have taken on, but to give some sort of an idea of what we, and when I say we, I really mean I, felt before in front of these cathedrals. And I also thought there was a great opportunity to put the literature of the Middle Ages, which really was my specialty, that is to say words, together with the objects themselves, with images. And in this, I was very influenced as well by my wife, Ellen Handler-Spitz, who is an art historian, and many of the, I won't say many of the ideas, but many of the ways of looking come from her. And she pushed me to look in certain ways that I hadn't before, and to articulate what I was seeing in certain ways that I wasn't before. And there was the famous intellectual Walter Benjamin said, "You write the books that you can't find in the library." And I really couldn't find anything between very scholarly things that required you to know a great deal about the Middle Ages, and the kind of touristy things that didn't give you enough. There was, of course, the Guide Michelin, but the Guide Michelin is often very baffling when you pick it up, unless you're looking for restaurants. And so I found there was a kind of niche that I could comfortably situate what I had to say in. I know you're not supposed to end a sentence with a preposition, but there you go.
It means you've got to add another sentence quickly before anyone notices. So But could you tell us a little bit about your thinking as you were writing the book about the audience for the book? Who's using this book? How are they using it? Where are they reading it? Are they reading it in bed? Are they reading it on the train? Are they reading it in the cathedral? It reminded me of certain passages in Ruskin Stones of Venice where you're actually in the building.
Well,
So-
that was the goal, to go around it and then in the building. Well, my ideal readership was the people who come to the American Library in Paris, but from there on it went to. I thought the ideal readership was the those who read the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the I won't say the New York Times anymore, but someone who is interested in learning more about the thing itself. As for I don't care too much where they read it as long as they buy it. But bed, I don't know. It will put you to sleep unless you really are awake. And my ideal reader was someone who'd come to Paris with the book and who would read a chapter the night before going to see the cathedral. And I haven't seen it, but I'm sure it's published as well on these iPads, these handheld devices in which you could take with you actually to the, is it, do you know? Anybody know that? Could actually take with you to the cathedral and have some sort of introduction to what it is that you're seeing.
It would be wonderful, actually, if you could point your iPhone at something in the cathedral. You actually mentioned some tool that does that, but if you could do that with your book, because you very beautifully take us, it's a very iconographical reading of these buildings, and it's this on their religious significance, but also what stories are being told and to whom, the difference between a cathedral where the populace will come in versus the Sainte-Chapelle, for instance, which you make a clear distinction that this is not a place that farmers are going into. And therefore, there's no reference to the zodiac or to the labors of the months or this sort of thing. But it would be, it's very much a way of reading a cathedral, but helping us to read the cathedral to slow down. I think very few tourists today have the patience really to try to decode a stained glass window. They just admire its colors as a kind of mosaic image.
Right. And of course, in most of the cathedrals that have elaborate stained glass, you can only do a few. At the time, my idea was that a reader would devote one day to each cathedral, and you could get there in a day and back and learn something about it and enjoy it in that way.
Now the questions are going to get more provocative, I have to tell you. But, can you tell us something about the choice of the buildings? As I mentioned, of course, my first thought was, what is Paris and her cathedrals? Any city has but one cathedral because it's the seat of one bishop, which led me to my false conclusion that this is going to be about the confrontation of religions. But you take us to really throughout the Ile-de-France and beyond. So my question is this: it is striking that you choose only the most famous, and I wonder, did you consider at any point taking visitors to discover the parish churches of Paris, for instance, or the remains of monastic complexes? Could think of parish churches, Saint-Séverin, Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, Saint-Médard. And you thank my former colleague, Stephen Merry, for all of his help at one point. So I too was next to him for many years as he worked on Amiens and others, but he has a whole generation now, probably the last generation he taught, of students who are interested in the question, what was the relationship between the cathedral workshops and parish churches, throughout, not only in Paris, but throughout the Ile-de-France. So I wondered if at any point you thought of the smaller scale, the more intimate, the parish church as something that might interest you, or are they so wrecked by the French Revolution that you thought they're not good enough, or what was your thinking in the actual choice?
The ones I picked were cathedrals about which I had enough to say to fill a chapter. And I also had a certain amount of pressure from my editor at Norton to pick these. And he is someone of great culture, but not that much. And these were the names he had heard. These were the names he had heard. And but frankly, I wanted to work on really the most famous, the most elaborate, the biggest. You can't use the word huge anymore, but the ones that seem to me be the most surrounded by culture that I was familiar with as well. Because, you know, with starting with Saint-Denis, you have this marvelous account by the Abbot Suger of of how the cathedral was built, and that's a sort of unique document. And I could play off of that literary work, or that verbal work. And then with Notre-Dame, we have, you know, the literature of Paris, which I could relate to the cathedral, and I thought was interesting. And then with Chartres, you have there are lots of written texts about it. And then, of course, in Amiens, there's a whole literature of actually obscene tales, comic tales from the north of France, the Fabliaux, which I knew about. But I found that the local sculpture in Amiens was an area in which I thought I could add something that hadn't been said. And then Reims, you know, because of its history of coronation of the French kings, was just such a great story. Beginning in the Middle Ages with the capture of that region by the Germans, and Clovis, who after the battle that he won, converted to Christianity and really made France. I thought you couldn't leave Reims out either. There were other big cathedrals that I didn't treat, like Rouen, which you know, I seemed to be in a state of disrepair in some ways that didn't send me there, or a few others that were so wrecked in the revolution that I could only show pictures of hammer marks on the front from enthusiastic revolutionaries.
So I was guessing at your choice. So tell me if this actually rings true. Because the follow-up to this question was, does your choice have to do with your interest in reading the relationship between power and architecture? You mentioned the kingship between centers of learning and architecture and iconography, because I think one of the great richnesses of this book, I'm going to act as your agent for a moment, is that you, through this very concrete reading of taking us around, asking people to take your book and slow down, please, look at this building, read it, take your time, let it evolve in front of you, but then you take us into the whole intellectual world, and you're very interested in points of juncture, points of that you perceive as moments of very important, not only political, but I would say intellectual, even sensibility shifts. So I wondered if some of the choice had to do with the, you know, not only the nation, the future nation France, but really kingship and the relationship of so many of these to royalty.
Yeah, absolutely. You're my ideal reader in the sense that absolutely relationship to these cathedrals and the making of France, not only power, but money. And I'm interested in not only how cathedrals made France in the Middle Ages, but also in the 19th century with Viollet-le-Duc, who had a great sense of that. And I tried in the book to give not only a medieval history, but a history of the cathedrals between the Middle Ages and roughly the present. But cathedrals are a city phenomenon. And I was interested in I've always been interested in cities. And I'm interested in the ways that cathedrals grew up in the city, how they made cathedrals, and then how cathedrals changed the city. I think, you know, this is one of often in treating art, we think of art as either reflecting the world around it, but we don't often think of art as making the world around it. And I think cathedrals had a great role in making not only Paris, but other cities, the cities that they are. And so here we see a kind of the activeness over a period of centuries of building these cathedrals. And of course, afterwards, we see how cities are made around and through cathedrals.
It's interesting you say. I mean, of course, it brings to mind the totally cliche and too often cited thing that Winston Churchill said, that we make our buildings and then they make us. But and also, since you evoke Viollet-le-Duc, for Viollet-le-Duc, the cathedral is actually about the ultimate secularization.
Absolutely.
And you actually echo that in your book. For him, in his famous Histoire d'une cathédrale et d'un hôtel de ville, it is actually about the relationship of the episcopate, which is for him an urban phenomenon moving out of the monasteries. For him, the move from Romanesque to Gothic is a move from the monastery into the civic realm, into the emergence of a different kind of shared power. I don't know if I have a really provocative question for you, but I picked up some sentences that I'm going to read back to you that are little nuggets that you leave for us. So this is perhaps a very provocative question, but you refer to yourself very rarely, sometimes. On page 52, you say, as a Jewish man of a certain age, and even though you are dealing with some of the most famous and holy sites of Christianity, you refer throughout to the Hebrew and to the Christian Bible. And finally, in your epilogue, you tell us that your perspective, quote, changes in the process of writing. And you speak of the cathedrals as belonging to more than one tradition. This is you. Not only do they hark back to the legacy of Judaism as well as Christianity. So I wondered if you could talk more about that, because that's very striking when you deal with the Old Testament very at great length and in interesting ways in the book.
Well, the Jewish part is hard to say because I find it I find it hard to write without being humorous in a certain way and without being ironic in a certain way. But then the Old Testament and New Testament implies that one was superseded by the other. And even in the cathedrals, they're so entwined that you mustn't see a cathedral as merely the kind of the triumph of the new over the old. And the question of many traditions, first of all, the cathedral doesn't just come from medieval Catholicism, but there's in Western Europe, but I tried to emphasize the roots that go all the way back to the Middle East, not only the Crusaders who saw Hagia Sophia at the time of the First Crusade, but there's lots of connection between the relics coming from the East and the cathedrals that were built in France. But also, you don't have to be a believing Catholic to go into a cathedral and feel something spiritual. And I tried in that respect to link the experience of the cathedral to any aesthetic or artistic experience which moves you. You can feel the same thing when you go into a museum or you see a piece of sculpture in a garden. You have this sense, and it's a romantic idea that there's something beyond just the material that you're looking at, which vibrates with you, and that anyone can feel that. You don't have to be from any particular tradition or even believe in a particular tradition. So I don't know whether that answers. Yeah.
I just thought it was something that really struck me. There's many themes that are woven throughout the book, even if there is the invitation to put it down and read the travel instructions, how to proceed the next day.
That was the editor. He said, you got to put in, what did he tell me? I've even repressed the word of what he called it in the beginning, beginning of a Wikipedia article. Yeah, we argued long and hard about that, but it was his money.
I wasn't trying to bring back trauma.
I knew this would come back.
No, it's very, literally there are the instructions how to get there in the first page. And it's good not to put in the restaurant recommendations because they might be superannuated quickly. So now yet another provocative claim, and I think this goes to another theme that's really important to bring out, because this book is not simply a kind of visual compendium to how to slow down and understand not only the spatial impact, but the extent to which the cathedral is a framework for telling these Bible stories, interwoven often with secular imagery. But you make the provocative claim, because there are portraits as well in many images, you make the provocative claim that many of the patrons, one thinks of donors' portraits of the Middle Ages, and now again your own words, may be the equivalents of today's entrepreneurs and industrialists, whose names and portraits adorn the walls of our universities, showing their reverence for the institution's mission of education and research. I won't editorialize to the extent to which I think you have a very romantic notion of 21st century patronage and donors, but I wondered if you thought about, if you could unpack that a little bit more, the relationship between what I'm thinking, but maybe I'm naive and you're a medievalist, is this quest for salvation through patronage in the Middle Ages, and what we might call the fear of paying taxes in 21st century America.
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I'm interested in how the cathedrals were financed, first of all, and it's clear that in some cases it was local businesses that actually profited from the pilgrims who came to town. And if you look at the donor windows, say at Chartres, you can find the shoemakers. You have to have good shoes to go on pilgrimage. The saddle makers, if you have a horse. You have the things you need to get to when you get to town, like food and water and bread. And these various, there weren't so many guilds in Chartres at the time, but these various occupations all gave windows, and they profited from the arrival of the equivalent of tourists in town in the 13th century. Then you have the higher up you go, the higher you get to, and of course the wine growers. Number of windows at Chartres are dedicated to wine growers from the region. And wine is part of the sacrament. You could see it that way, or you could see it that wine is something you need when you buy the food and the bread at the local market. Then the higher up you go, the more you have donations from wealthy patrons, nobles who gave windows, and many of them we know, participated in some not so savory activity at the time of the Crusades, and of course that is a way of purchasing salvation. The notion of purgatory was invented right around this time in the 13th century, which was a great bureaucratization of the afterlife, in the sense that you the more you contributed and the more your relatives contributed after your death, the less time you could spend in purgatory. So it's a fantastic sort of money-making scheme, and so how does that go with the modern donors? I don't have that much experience. Actually, one of the reasons I left Columbia was they told me I had to raise money, and I thought, what was, and I went to see the dean then of the graduate school. I said, "What do you want me to do? Print advertisements for the French department and shove it under the doors of Park Avenue people like menus?" And he said, "Yeah, that's an idea. We'll pay for the printing." and so that was, but there is a certain patina of nobility contributing to colleges these days, we know, but which also has origins, or whatever it is, in some kind of equivalent of the Crusades, or even rather salvation, rather than your own salvation, your spiritual salvation, it could just be an entrance for one of your children.
So happily, it's so far back the Middle Ages that we're not going to experience the transformation of stained glass windows like in one of the colleges at Yale recently.
Oh, right. Yeah,
so we're not going to get these patrons' portraits cut out because of their questionable activities in the Crusades, etc.
Right.
But I actually, one of the most compelling chapters of the whole book is, of course, on this is the Sainte-Chapelle chapter, which is an amazing story of a relationship between belief and finance and self-promotion and self-representation. So if you don't have a copy of the book already on the way out, you're making a big mistake. This follows up on this. We're at the very end of the book. The conclusion opens as many new pathways. It almost suggests that the book is not complete, that you could go on and write more. And you ask a question at the end, so I want you to elaborate. How is it that the construction of such monumental religious buildings coincided with a secularization of culture and of the everyday practices, manufacturing and transporting goods to market, buying and selling, working for wages, calculating cost, profit, and interest according to the bourgeois time of clocks? So I wondered, you asked the question, but this is on the next to the last page of the book, so
right.
I wondered if you could elaborate.
Right. Well, the 12th and 13th centuries, which are great, the great age of cathedral building, coincides with an enormous sort of secularization of intellectual life, city life, general cultural life. That is to say, we see the birth of vernacular literature in those centuries, and what is written in the vernacular, the language which is we call now Old French. The people who spoke it at the time thought they were speaking modern French. The birth of all kinds of love literature, obscene literature, satirical literatures, making fun of priests who eat too much and who fornicate too much. And you have Abelard, who at the University of Paris says he wants to introduce reason into faith. We sometimes call this period the Renaissance of the 12th century, of which the later Renaissance in the 16th and 17th centuries was just a second act. So you have, at the same time as you have this, what I see as a kind of questioning of religious faith and of religious people, you have cathedrals being built bigger and taller than ever before. And my own take on this is that the less faith there was, the more you had to affirm it with something concrete and spectacular. I don't know whether that makes any sense. Yeah, I know it's going against the current, but
Interestingly, it's picking up on the current.
well, the Viollet-le-Duc is behind just about everything. When I read him, and I read this man, Viollet-le-Duc, not only redid the cathedrals and saved them in the 19th century, he was one of the great pens. He was one of the great writers of the 19th century. And I don't think he's been surpassed.
Me to my next question, because I'm currently working on an upcoming exhibition that will be in New York in 2025 on Viollet-le-Duc and his drawings. So I've been deeply in Viollet-le-Duc the last 6 months, but I've always been deeply in Viollet-le-Duc. And once I actually had a postcard from a friend when I was a graduate student saying, I'm sending you a postcard of this building because I think it was untouched by Viollet-le-Duc. And it took me some time to find it. And you and I had a nice exchange about Viollet-le-Duc in language some years ago.
Right.
So I wondered that, for me, of course, I see everything through the lens of the 19th century. So I wondered that this 19th century history, which for me, all these cathedrals were reinvented in the 19th century, doesn't enter always into your consideration of these buildings. On the other side of the Romantic rediscovery of the Middle Ages. And I wondered how you conceived that historic moment when you were describing these buildings, that they had all been through a great 19th century salvation, remaking, completion. What are your
Well, first thought is they wouldn't be here if it weren't for that movement. I know I didn't emphasize so much his contribution, but tried to describe what was there. I wasn't interested, so much in the history of the evolution of the building as what you could see now. But I do come back to him over and over again, and he's absolutely key. And as a draftsman, as a draftsman, he's unsurpassed. He never went to architectural school.
He refused to go.
I know, yeah. He went on a walking tour of Sicily and Italy and drew and learned how buildings were constructed from that. So, yeah, no, the whole book could have been on Viollet-le-Duc, but he's absolutely essential.
So I'm sure that we're going to turn in a little while to the audience. So I hope I'm not preempting some of the questions which I'm imagining are on people's mind, particularly those of you who are living in Paris or in France rather than passing through. You do, and we perhaps should talk more about your wonderful discussion of Reims and the Rockefellers, etc. That would also be a topic of discussion. But I wanted to take you to some of the controversies of very recent date about these buildings. So inevitably, I'm sure the project was born before the fire in 2019, and so
Yes.
that is on people's minds as we get there. So I'd like to talk to you about that, but there are others as well. Maybe we could start with color, because the whole issue of polychromy, of multicolored, we often don't like, whether it's the ancient Greek monuments or medieval monuments. One of the obsessions with the 19th century was that these had been misunderstood by the genesis of art history in the 18th century, because it was always presumed that the purity, particularly of the sculpture, but not only of the sculpture, of the architectural elements, whether it be the columns of a Greek temple or whether it be the piers and vaults of the wonderful structural cage of a Gothic cathedral, were to be realized as kind of pure stone elements. And yet there's an extraordinary amount of evidence in the 19th century became obsessed with this, of the fact that these buildings were richly, richly colored. Although most of the color that we see today was indeed the recreation of Viollet-le-Duc and his disciples.
Right.
And some of it has recently been restored, whether it be the apse chapels, the chevet chapels of Notre-Dame, which are probably now completely smoke-filled, even though they had just been restored, some of them just before the fire. But one of the greatest controversies was over Chartres, the so-called repainting of Chartres, which completely changes what has been the 20th century love of this building, which is the way that the architecture almost disappears behind the famous Chartres bleu that evokes. So I wondered what is your own, you don't talk that much about it, so what is your own feeling about the recent repainting of Chartres, the bringing back of this kind of white cathedral rather than the dark stone cathedral that we grew up with?
Well, I know it's a little like the restoration hardware version of Chartres that's there. I'm learning to like it. The first time I saw it, I was shocked. And that's because it's not only the stone, but the windows. I think you see the windows are even more spectacular through dirty stone, surrounded by dirty stone. And your eye, it's in a way the Monet question. Monet said that if he was wearing a white shirt while he was painting, that white shirt changed his perception of color beyond it and on the canvas. But the white does change your perception of the windows. And I'm old enough to realize, though, that I'm not going to live long enough to get dirty again, and and for it to be the way it was. So I'm learning to adapt to it, and I think certain of the things are quite wonderful. I see you shaking your head in the back. This is a controversy over whether they should have repainted the inside of Chartres, which which is really plaster with stone mortar lines painted between to make it appear that it's the actual courses of stone. But some things are actually spectacular, like the gold shield bosses, for example. I love looking up and seeing them against the white. And then, of course, a place like Amiens was brightly colored, and they do a polychromy show at night there. I've never seen it, but to Saint-Denis, where they actually project with very precise colors, project what it might have looked like. But it is a kind of hyper fluorescent version of what it could have looked like at the time. And having just seen the show at the Met in New York, with the restored Greek sculpture repainted, I don't want to go there. It is a kind of Disneyland version of the sculpture. I prefer them completely white if that's what they're going to do.
Of course, that has been the controversy since this emerged, the famous polychromy or multicolored controversy of the early 19th century, because people said it's not possible.
Yeah.
All of our aesthetic, whether you were neoclassicist or whether you were neo-Gothic person, the aesthetic was based on this pure structural principle that the insistence that archaeologically it was colored. People said, no, this is too kitsch. It's not possible.
Yeah, right. And then there's the question of the stained glass. In the 18th century, the 17th and 18th century, we call it the centuries of light and the Enlightenment, right? But many of the canons who were responsible for taking care of the glass in these cathedrals decided there was too much darkness, and they took out the beautifully colored glass in many places in order to have more light. So that
is the chief example.
Amiens is a terrific example of that, and those will never get back. So I mean, that's just lost, and that's a real regret.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison to go from Amiens to Chartres. That's really kind of the alpha and omega of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So the burning elephant in the room is Notre-Dame. And I became involved in this controversy as well. So, of course, when the tragic fire happened in April 2019, I think it was, the first reaction of, I was a bit shocked. I'm of the generation that tried to restore interest in the 19th century in and of itself. Felt as though we spent decades rehabilitating Viollet-le-Duc, and suddenly Viollet-le-Duc is the grand villain once again. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, in fact, on the most famous statement that Viollet-le-Duc makes in the dictionary, where he has an entry on the word that one of his great texts is the 10 volumes of the Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture française, and he has an entry on restoration, which starts out wonderfully, and this is for you, the historian of words. Le mot et la chose sont modernes. Both the word and the thing are modern, and then he goes on to define restoration, but as well to define his own theory of restoration, which he famously says, to restore a building is to take it back to a historical moment that it may never have known historically. So, which is a very fascinating, paradoxical thought that takes us to the heart of French 19th century romantic thought. So in the course of our conversation, I'd love to hear about that, but Viollet-le-Duc did quite a number of things at Notre-Dame, and much of what one loved before the fire, whether it be the replacing of the Gallery of Kings, whether it be most particularly the painting of the chapels, but of course the addition of the gargoyles, but most particularly the addition of the flesh over the crossing.
Right.
And that was, of course, the dramatic moment of the fire was when finally the flesh, the crossing spire, collapsed and brought down with it the crossing vaults and fell into the crossing of the nave. Almost immediately, in the speeches that President Macron gave, he said, "Oh no, the Notre-Dame is our national cathedral. It can evolve with us. It can be a modern cathedral. Forget about UNESCO, which is in our 15th arrondissement. We will rebuild Notre-Dame better than ever, and we will have an international competition for the design of a new spire." I was one of those who signed the petition in the Figaro, and then there was an interview with me in Le Monde, absolutely violently disagreeing with this decision, which absolutely, from my point of view, the Senate finally put the kibosh on this. So I wondered, what was your feeling about the sudden notion in 2019 that Viollet-le-Duc was not part of this cathedral, that rather than restoring it, he had wrecked it, and therefore one should take this great opportunity to remove what he had done?
I always disagreed with anyone who vilified Viollet-le-Duc. I mean, I thought that he had not only Viollet-le-Duc, but his father, who was a medievalist and curator of national monuments, had a great knowledge of the Middle Ages, and what he did was, I always thought, was fantastic, even if it wasn't authentic, whatever that means. But when I looked at some of the designs that had been proposed, to put one of those wind turbines on top, a parking lot on top, a swimming pool on top for full immersion baptisms, a Gucci style stained glass top, a horticultural garden for menaced insect life in Paris. I mean, it was just astonishing. Of course, there was so much. There were a lot of sort of. They looked up the spire and they thought the sky was the limit in terms of proposing various architectural things. I frankly, looking around at the French projects, at La Défense, or the new library in the 13th, or the pyramid, even at the Louvre, or at Beaubourg, I thought that there was probably a part of the French character, national character, that couldn't resist new materials for $1 billion, and yet there was the element of time, and so I was extremely glad for two reasons when they decided just to restore the 19th century version. One was that I liked it so much, and the other was my book was predicated on it, and if they had suddenly changed it in the middle, it would have really upset not only me but my editor. So I didn't want to have to wait a long time, so I was extremely relieved.
So two recommendations in it, in addition to number one, which is to buy Howard Bloch's book on the way out, because he's not here all the time to sign it for you. The other is, if you haven't already, go to the Cité de l'Architecture at Trocadéro, because happily, a very short number of weeks before the fire, the statues that Viollet-le-Duc had created with the sculptor Geoffroy de Chaume were taken off the spire for the restoration. So they were not present when the fire happened, and they were therefore undamaged. And they are now on exhibition at in the Cité de l'Architecture, which is the descendant of a museum that was conceptualized by Viollet-le-Duc called the Musée de la Sculpture Comparée. So in this museum of casts, in the center of what he imagined as a great pedagogical instrument and celebration of the French Middle Ages, are now the actual sculptures, which are greater than life size, of the figures that were on the spire at Notre-Dame. So you weren't actually meant to go have a conversation with them, but now you can look up into the face of Viollet-le-Duc, who strangely enough is St. Thomas, and you will recognize his portrait. He's the only one of the statues that's not looking straight out. He's going like this because he was looking up at the spire itself, which was his great addition to his desire simultaneously to complete Notre-Dame, but also in some ways to take it back to a glory that he thought it had lost, which I think is also one of your projects in this book. So that's not so much a question as a recommendation for everybody to take advantage of the fact that these sculptures, which will happily go back onto the spire when it's rebuilt now, are currently on display at the Cité de l'Architecture. Before I open it up to the audience, what is the question I should have asked you but didn't?
Oh gosh, I don't know. It's no. I so appreciate the questions that you did ask because they show I've had one careful reader, and thank you. And that's a rare thing. Thank you. Yeah.
Can we have a big round of applause both for interviewer and interviewee? Thank you. Are there indeed any audience?
One of the first of all, thank you so very much, both of you. One of the things I immediately experience when I'm in the cathedrals is the sense of awe at the just raw physicality of how they were built. You look at Notre Dame today with the cranes, and we bring the full force of modern technology, and we're talking 1,000 or more years ago. I picture horses, oxen, pulleys, raw sinew strength. Do you address, or do you have any recommendation on the physical construction part of these buildings?
Well, I try to treat that with where it's relevant. You know, we look up and we see that crane, which is a spectacular object. But if you look at the restoration, and there's scaffolding all over, but if you look at the 19th century, some photographs actually of the restoration in the 19th century, 1847, you can see there's some version of those, of all that scaffolding then. Of course, it wasn't made out of steel with the same sort of joists as now. Maybe it was. But they had some equivalent in the Middle Ages when they built them. And we know from certain manuscript images of cathedral building that there was a system of scaffolding made with wood. If you look along the front of Notre-Dame, you'll see holes, lots of holes in the actual walls, which is where scaffolding was inserted when they put it up. Go take a look when it's done. And then we have pictures of cranes in medieval manuscripts, which shows how they did it. Of course, it wasn't as efficient as today, and even in the 1920s and 30s, it took the equivalent of the Notre-Dame fire was the bombing of Reims, which completely destroyed the roof in 14 through 17, and it burned the same way that Notre-Dame did. It took 20 years to rebuild, and they're now doing it in, 4 or 5. You know, we've become much more efficient, but our techniques are really not that different. And we've discovered from these catastrophes how sophisticated they really were. For instance, you know, the bombing of Reims was hit by 287 German shells in World War I, and some of the stones which came down, you know, have a kind of coating on the back, which shows that they may have been assembled on the ground and then taken up the scaffolding and reassembled on top. We just, you know, discovered, you know, these stones are not just sitting on top of each other, but they have sort of staples, big iron staples between them. And we discover a lot about the building of these cathedrals from their destruction and rebuilding. And I don't know, I don't know if we'll do any better. There's probably no better way to put up a vault than what they used in the Middle Ages with these. If you look at these struts underneath the flying buttresses of Notre-Dame, these wooden struts, that's just how they did it. Just how they did it in the Middle Ages. They put the struts up first, then they piled the stone and mortar on top, and when the stone and mortar was dry, they took the struts out. So it's old technique,
I think in addition to Howard's book, the best book you can get in the library is probably in the children's division, which is David Macaulay's Cathedral, which has these absolutely wonderful illustrations of what was technically involved. And there are perhaps more scholarly books, more detailed books, but that one is very dramatic to read.
Thank you. More audience, yes.
Thank you both. On a more practical and perhaps more mundane level, could you simply take 2 of the 6 cathedrals and quickly compare and contrast them so that a possible visit might be more interesting or enlightened for us?
Ooh, that's, it's like asking you to choose 2 of your children and compare them. They can be hard. Well, Chartres, I think, is a no miss. Chartres is a kind of jewel, in part because it's so far from Paris, it wasn't destroyed so badly as some of the others. And then I also, well, there's the Sainte-Chapelle, which is not, if you give me a third, because it's not really a cathedral, it's a Palatine chapel that you probably have seen if you're in Paris. And then Amiens, I think, is also a jewel, a big, elaborate wedding cake of a cathedral with so much sculpture that it's just hard to take it all in, but very, very impressive. So I would say Amiens, Chartres, and I assume you've seen the Sainte-Chapelle.
Is there an order in which you think we should visit these cathedrals?
Well, I talk about that in the introduction of the book. I visited these cathedrals with my students each summer for a number of years, and I give you the order for which they pay a lot of tuition, and and that is to say, we go to Saint-Denis, which is supposedly the first of the cathedrals, first and easily accessible, and then from there to Notre-Dame, and from Notre-Dame to Chartres. Then from Chartres we come back to the Sainte-Chapelle, and then from then we go to Amiens, and then to Reims. I would say is the order. The order is in the book, and that's the way I do it. Only because I did it that way because writing a book is partially a technique of memory, and my memory for putting these things together was formed by what seemed to me like a nice rhythm of leaving Paris and coming back, and then going to a place in Paris, and then leaving it again and coming back. So that, I think, is the one that I don't mention really too much is Beauvais, which is on the way to you can't get there on the train, even though you can see it from the window. If you go up the highway, you can't get there because of the radial quality of French railroads. But Beauvais was never actually completed, and it really is a special cathedral. But I wanted to speak to a more general audience.
More in-person questions? Yes. Yeah.
In the medieval cathedrals, I find the iconography of the stained glass windows incredibly perplexing, because it assumes that one knows a lot about religious history, the Bible.
Right.
How is the best way, in your opinion, to go about understanding the iconography when one walks into a cathedral, a medieval cathedral, and the stained glass windows are original? How should one approach that and attack it as get something really meaningful from it?
First of all, with my book, and second, no, that's a good question. I mean, because the stained glass is often very perplexing unless you have a deep biblical culture, both Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and New Testament, Christian Bible. And so you can find, if you know the various stories and look and which window is which, you can sort of follow it. And we know there's a general rule you read from bottom to top. But these windows have been moved around a lot in cathedrals. Some of the glass panels have actually been moved around in the windows. Some of the windows are not actual biblical stories, but are theme windows, such as the zodiac window in Chartres. If you're from California and you know your zodiac back and forth, you'll have no trouble with that one. But there's the and then there's some which actually come from local legends, which are very hard to know. But and then some tell actually literary stories. There's a Charlemagne window at Chartres, which combines 3 or 4 works about Charlemagne from the Middle Ages, including the first French epic, which is the Song of Roland. And you can, pick, if you know the Song of Roland, you can pick bits and pieces out of that. But I don't know what else to do. Oh, yes, absolutely. They're the themes. There's a theme of the works and the days, the labors of the month, kind of themed.
The Tree of Jesse.
The dream of Jesse is all over, and the tree of Jesse, what's known as the tree of Jesse, that grows out of the root of Jesse's stomach and ends up with Christ on top. That's almost in every cathedral. There are lots of signs of the zodiac as well. I'm trying to think. There are various themes, such as what are known as the birth of Christ theme, which involve the Annunciation, the Visitation, and the Nativity. You can find that all over. And then, of course, there is the windows that deal with the Passion. All of these are most elaborate, really, in Chartres, but you can find them all over.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I thought that was the most original idea that I had in the whole book. I'd never read, in all the stuff I read about cathedrals, I never saw any writer who said, bring a pair of binoculars. And
You're right, it's key. Yeah,
what
it's key. I do think that the big mystery, though, that remains, at least for me, maybe you can tell me as a medievalist, we always assume, at least since Ruskin, the Bible of Amiens, that we're dealing with a largely illiterate culture, although perhaps it's not as illiterate as we sometimes imagine. And so how clear were these windows to medieval visitors who were not members of the clergy? Now, of course, parts of the stories would be woven into the Mass, but a lot of it not.
And into sermons.
And in the sermons,
yeah, right. Well, I think, what we forget a little bit today is that these cathedrals were amazing teaching tools. They were connected to schools, and they meant to give visual examples of many of the things that were taught in schools. And I can see priests and teachers, pointing out, who were literate, pointing out images of the various biblical stories they dealt with. And then they have the question of, were the people who made them literate or not? Or were they just, but there we have a great artistic principle, which I think is everywhere, which is that all art comes from other art. And these people imitated each other extraordinarily. And there there is this sort of myth, and I'm not sure how much of a myth it is, but that the various workers on the cathedrals went from site to site. And they clearly saw what was there. They imitated what was there. Even the Abbé Suger, who makes the first cathedral, he's been to Rome 4 times. And he's seen extremely impressive monuments in Rome. And we sort of forget that there's that influence as well. So there is this sense that literate or not, they knew how to make images, and they saw other images and they imitated them.
I guess it was the PowerPoint of the Middle Ages.
I'd like to just acknowledge the Zoom audience because we had at the peak of your discussion 54 people on Zoom. So hello to our Zoom audience. So delighted to have you here. Let me just ask one question in the interest of time, since we don't want to take up anyone's time more than we need to. This is from Anne, who writes, I find Reims very special because of these angel sculptures. Do we find these significantly displayed at other cathedrals?
Angels.
Angels.
Well, there really is nothing like, there are angels on the west facade of many cathedrals, but nothing like that placement of the angels on the top of Reims.
So that was a very quick one. So let me ask another one. This is from Marge Musil, and this is maybe as a way to transition to the final remarks and encourage people finally to buy them. Are the illustrations in the hardcover in the hardcover in color or black and white?
Black and white. This was another big argument, and I was told, you know, the big signifier in the last years has been the pandemic, and I was told by my editor that the price of paper had gone up so much that he couldn't do this and he couldn't do that. So you can't argue with the pandemic.